Okay, welcome back, everyone. I've learned so much in this conference. I had a really high expectations, given all the incredible people who decided to join our conference and decided to generously share their work with us. And I'm really moved and excited about what's happened in the past 4 days. I haven't processed it yet, and I think it'll take me a while. It's also, I can just, since we're towards the end, I'll say this is really moving since this happened. This has been the hardest year of my life by far. And there were many moments when we thought to potentially just cancel the conference. And this whole process was a tribute, like I said in my opening remarks. This was also a real process of kin making and friendship that Sven, Eric, Kasia, Stephen, and Dominic stuck with me, stuck with the project, and Jovita, and brought everyone here together. And it's been so exciting. So the idea for this wrap-up session is to let loose, try to start processing. I know we can't process everything that fast, but to get going and hear some remarks. I'll consider it a really great discussion if I talk very little. So I'll just pose the opening question. We have Dominic Williams, Miriam Udell, and Daniel Stein here as our lead discussants to get the ball rolling. And my hope, though, is that everyone can join in. Unlike in the other discussions, in the other panels, I'd really just like you to raise your hand electronically and I'll call on you. No need to type your question into the chat, and it doesn't have to be fully formed or anything like that. So let's get started. First question, what was one sentence, paraphrased, I'm assuming, from someone's lecture that struck you and why? Should we start with Miriam?
Sure. So I'm going to cheat by linking two very short snippets because one of the things that I find myself thinking about a lot in general is that Yiddish itself always had to be made. And that was true during the Holocaust, and it's certainly been true in the post-war period. And so I'm just thinking about the journey from what Jim Diamond called the petitionary bursts of Yiddish in the writing of the Eish Kodesh, where Yiddish bursts through as this language of intimacy and strong feeling, the God who is really due, who is really present, the long journey between the petitionary bursts of Yiddish and what Rivka Margolis called Yiddish as an oral signifier of an imagined Jewish memorial landscape, if I've gotten that right, where in one case, Yiddish is so much inside, and in the other case, Yiddish is so much out there as background, as kind of non-specific signifier. And that's a really long, complicated arc. And I think just the awareness, one of the things that has really been coming up for me over the 4 days is the awareness of where I fit in that, where my family fits in that, all of the sort of structures of feeling that undergird my research that pertains to Yiddish and the Holocaust.
Cool, thanks. Daniel?
I guess since we're breaking rules, I'll also just break quickly a couple and just offer really gratitude to the organizers of the conference before we start for the hard work you all invested in bringing us together and the intentionality that was put into that work, and also just speaking, since I'm talking for, I guess, graduate students, the real thoughtfulness that was put into the graduate student sessions as well was so deeply beneficial. So I want to thank you all for that, and also thank Lera Roskis, who I haven't heard for maybe 20 years, and it's really wonderful to be in your presence again. So I want to thank you for that. I want to put just two maybe tensions on the table as well. So one is just from the very opening session, the scholar that Eric cited, who referred to Yiddish as the language of obscure knowledge, versus Hannah, your statement about Yiddish as the language of indigenous knowledge. I think that tension is something I'm kind of sitting with. And then also the tensions, just very briefly, between the abstraction of the experience of the Shoah, or the Holocaust or the Nazi genocide of European Judaism, and the specificity of Yiddish that came through in Lara Roski's lecture. I think I'm also really curious to talk more about those two tensions.
Dominic. By the way, I figured out that Dominic has known me longer than anyone else in this conference, including Lara Roski's. Okay, now with that embarrassing introduction, please.
You're showing our ages there, Hannah. Yeah, I mean, as you say, this conference has been a really kind of intense experience, and obviously there's all sorts of things that I'm still having to kind of like work through and think about, and I'm not sure I have a great answer to your first. I mean, I'm not sure I've got a great answer to any of your questions, but I'm not sure I've got a great answer to your first question about a sentence. I'm going to plead the kind of Eurovision effect here and say that, you know, it's the ones that go first, the ones that go last, and apologies for that reference to our American colleagues if that goes over your head. But and that's Eric's statement at the beginning where he said, you know, silence is eminently translatable, and I think there's something very powerful about that, and I think that's something that we need to bear in mind, that we shouldn't just be listening for and listening to silence, and that surely is one of the things that this conference is about. I do sort of perversely want to say, is it? Aren't there different kinds of silences? Aren't there different things that silence involves and embodies and means in different contexts? Yiddish silence is the same as Polish silences, English silences, but I thought it was a great way to start things off, and I think it was a very yeah, I thought it was a great prompt, and fundamentally I agree and disagree at the same time. So.
Yeah, I see Eric has his hand raised. Maybe he's here to complain about the Eurovision reference.
No, I'm Euro enough to totally get that. So, but although not as Euro as my name might indicate, but yeah. So Dominic, I also agree and disagree with myself. And in the Lessons for Legacies prompt, I actually put in and asked, "Does silence have an accent?" was one of the questions that I put into the prompt, and I think that's very well taken. I want to also just thank everyone. It's been incredibly meaningful, and I feel like I'm going to be following up and having conversations with a lot of you, and I hope so. I also want to especially thank Lara Roski's, and I want to publicly acknowledge that it was a seminar with David at the Holocaust Museum that I spent a week under his tutelage, and it was the first time that I learned about the Oinik Shabbos archive. I never would have gotten into this field. I started studying Yiddish more intently after that. I'd done one summer at the Zimmer program. I thought it would be kind of a background thing to know a little bit. That would be good to have. And he's really the entire impetus for me moving into this direction. And I just wanted to acknowledge that and thank you profoundly for that. You've had an incredible influence on my entire career. And in terms of things that I take away, I mean, there's so many things, but if I were to focus on one thing, Carolina's emphasis on nature, I think is so fascinating. And I know that there's been things written about nature and the Holocaust, and I haven't read everything, so I may be missing something that's really obvious. But as I read, Holocaust literature, nature is so fascinating, and it seems to have, both. It can be very, very concrete and sort of rooted in locality, and it also has a national sort of discourse, right? I mean, there's a Polish nature, there's a German nature, and the kind of romantics are really leaning into that. There's a very personal connection to nature, and there's also this transcendent sort of supranational, maybe even superhuman, kind of in an awesome sort of Spinozan sort of sense, that all of this that's going on is somehow in the big scheme of things not so terrible. I've seen examples of all of those in ways that you read, and I'm thinking even of like a non-Jewish writer like Robert Antelme in L'Espèce Humaine, he writes about nature as being something that the Nazis couldn't control, and they could control almost every damn thing about you and your existence. The fact that they couldn't control the weather was somehow very deeply satisfying. So I feel like these different relationships, it can both be a connection to the land and kind of exile from the land. And so that was something that got me thinking, and I would like to see more work on that. But I just wanted to flag that her contribution to sort of thinking through nature and the role of reacclimating to a place or feeling alienated from a place, nature landscape and so on. Thanks.
Definitely, maybe a follow-up conference in the making. Also
I
thinking
think
of
it'd be a great volume or conference.
a
Yeah,
wood
it's
cut
really
of
rich.
the Ballade von Nächtigen Wald that Matt showed us was also a tribute to that theme. Anyone
Totally.
else, any other participants like to jump in and point something out, a paraphrase, one sentence, one point that struck them throughout the conference? Going once? Okay, I'm not going in order with the questions. I want to, we all like it. We all want to get along. Our lives are all difficult as it is. So nobody's, the days of the toxic conference participants are kind of gone. So we've all established that we're collegial and we respect each other's scholarship. Are there nonetheless tensions or gaps that have come up in this conference? Are there disagreements, or are there different approaches that we have to work to resolve? Let's go in the same order as before. Miriam.
Yeah, now I'm really caught out because I was hoping I could just kind of skip that one.
Okay, well, you can still skip
I'm
it.
gonna pass for now, actually.
All right, Daniel?
So, just reflecting a little bit, it seems to me that the Holocaust in the academy lives oftentimes in English departments, or perhaps, there's this enormous amount of work in whatever this field of Holocaust studies is that's very disconnected from the type of work that goes on at conferences like this. And I know for myself, the task of acquiring Yiddish was remarkably challenging and took a great deal of time and effort to acquire, comprehensive, like the ability to comprehend the language, let's say. And I wonder what work scholars can do to make the type of things that are presented in conferences like this more accessible to a broader field, and to really advocate in ways that makes this part of whatever the canon of Holocaust studies is.
Dominic, any tensions that came up to your mind?
I think Miriam and Daniel have both finessed that question, and I'm probably going to do the same. Although I very much agree with Daniel. Right. I mean, I think the tension that comes up really is between what's going on here and what you see going on in other kinds of scholarship. Right. Eric mentioned somebody saying, well, Yiddish is a kind of obscure language. This is what happened with, Hannah, at the conference that you came to so kindly and delivered such an amazing keynote last summer. In organizing that, there was a discussion of, isn't Yiddish a bit of a niche subject here?
Yeah.
Which I want to go and sort of scream into a pillow about, or something about that, like that. But so certainly that's an issue, and I don't have an answer to what Daniel says. I'll just say something else. I can see other people have got their hands up and probably have more valuable things to say than me. But the thing that I feel you often find as a tension in something like in Holocaust studies conferences is between literary people and historians. And they often get quite annoyed with each other and sort of say, the historians are sort of saying, well, so what? This just you talking about your personal response to a poem, and literary people say, God, you've just spent 18 minutes telling me a chronology of things that happened, and then spend 2 minutes sort of going, well, getting some really minor significance out of it, kind of thing. There's a sort of frustration that we feel it's sort of at odds with each other. And I didn't feel that was going on here at all. And I think some of that also, we might say, comes out, and at least, you know, one scholar here had the courage, and I think that was really fantastic to do, to say, look, you know, my Yiddish could be better. And I think that was one thing that could have been a tension, right? That there are people who feel more comfortable and people who are more, I guess, hinnersche Fieseler, like me nowadays. But that, I think, didn't happen. And I think that's one thing that is important. And I guess that's my best answer to Daniel, right? It is important, and it's important to value knowledge, and it's important to value being sort of inside the language and being able to know the language. But we need to be able to kind of welcome. Why am I putting myself in that way? People who know Yiddish really thoroughly need to be able to welcome people who take an interest in it as well.
Yes,
So,
excellent.
yeah.
Thank you, and I'm so glad to see hands up. So let's go in order. Avinoam, please.
Thank you. So I'll actually two points, and I guess I was going to say something else, but I'll respond to this thread that was just brought up first, which is, yeah, I think in particular, Daniel emphasized sort of the tension between, let's say, literature scholars and historians. And I think this is a really important point if we think about one of the challenges in Holocaust studies, which is to focus much more attention on Jewish responses and the degree of training that is required to train the next generation of scholars to really engage with Jewish source material. And I think this not only is something that's a responsibility for the field of Holocaust studies, for us to have a much better sense of the diversity, the variety of Jewish responses, but also for Judaic studies as well, that we have to have scholars who are trained in modern Jewish history and Jewish languages and Jewish life and culture before the war to have a better sense and understanding of how Jews responded during the war. And I think this goes into much deeper issues that requires training, so that it's not just, you know, that we have sort of a divide in the field and people who might come from, let's say, literature or the arts or theater or film, who are doing representations and then sort of apply that skill to Holocaust studies. We need much more integration, I think so. And I think one of the things that's become clear through these amazing sessions throughout the conference is how much more work there is to be done in that regard. I mean, we have millions of pages of source material in Yiddish that, you know, there's just not enough people trained to be able to do this research, which is going to be so important for the future of Holocaust studies. So that's just one response to that thread that I think is so important that's come through. Not a tension necessarily or a contradiction, but something that came up to me that I think is that, you know, I wrote down that I find intriguing, is that I think throughout the sessions, we see sort of various different emphasis on the value of Yiddish. So Yiddish either being the carrier of humor, which I talked about, or Yiddish being a language of mourning, or Yiddish being sacred, or Yiddish being a language of piety, etc. And so one of the things that I would love to see us think about a little bit more is how do we distinguish between what might be Jewish responses expressed in Yiddish and what are actually authentically Yiddish responses. And you know, there's obviously a slippage between Yiddish and Jewish in the words themselves, but how do we distinguish what's actually Yiddish and what's actually Jewish expressed in Yiddish? And you have a question here about sort of the multilingual context, question number 3, and that might be a way to get behind it, right? To see like what's expressed in Polish, what's expressed in Hungarian, thinking about Chaim Kaplan and the transition to writing a diary in Hebrew, right? Sort of all of these things are like, how are things expressed differently in this multilingual context? And think about that more, to think about how, when Yiddish is used specifically, like what work is Yiddish actually doing? What is it specifically expressing?
Thank you. I see, Miriam, I see that you lowered your hand, so I'll
Yeah,
call
no.
on Joel, but if you
No,
have
no,
it.
sorry.
Back
I
up.
lowered my
Okay.
hand because I figured it registered.
It registered. Okay, so
yeah.
Miriam and then Joel, because I don't want it to be that only men get to talk about tensions. Okay.
Sure. No, it took me a moment because I did not experience the tension as arising from the conference. But if we're going to kind of broaden that to something that I was bringing into the conference, I think that there is a really deep tension that was evident in my own graduate training about the extent to which, first of all, the extent to which the Holocaust is a coherent thing. And I'm thinking a lot about the language that I'm hearing about our contemporary moment of polycrisis and wondering whether it was being experienced in that way in the 30s and as it came into the 40s. But attention about the extent to which the Holocaust is a Jewish story or is a set of events that's not fundamentally Jewish, and Jews are implicated and have a response and have produced culture as part of that response. But that really bears interrogating, and that is closely related to, and I think we'll get to this a little more in depth with one of the other questions, but it's really quite inextricable from questions around how the Holocaust is used, how it's mobilized, how Holocaust memory is mobilized, the ends to which it is put in contemporary discourse, and that use begins quite early, before my undergraduates walk into my classroom. So I resisted teaching a course about the Holocaust for the longest time. I mean, for a decade and a half, I would include some cultural products that arose in or out of the Holocaust, and certainly those that reflected on it post-war, but never anything directly about Holocaust until last fall when I co-taught a course with a historian, and we kind of made that oscillation between the historical record and representation the focus of the course. And we taught about children and the Holocaust, but it really took me a long time to reach a point where that felt like a salutary intellectual activity and a necessary intervention. So I think that there's a lot of tension there to keep thinking about and unpacking.
Thank you. Thanks. Polycrisis. That is a very, very apt phrase or term, excuse me. Joel, please.
Thanks. I'll be a male voice, not really talking about conflict, but maybe the opposite. No, it's sort of, I was, even before Dominic was talking, I was thinking about the way in which so much of this conference, I think, has kind of gone in the opposite direction from the sort of trend that Dominic was talking about, that we often see, of these sort of siloed areas. And one of the things that has been incredibly exciting and fruitful for me over the last few days is seeing, I mean, sort of bringing back to, my own focus of theater, seeing people come at theater and drama from very different directions. I'm trained as a theater historian, and I've spent most of my career focusing on Yiddish theater. And I can think of works that sort of related to various, Yiddish writers and things, where it feels like the authors have kind of bent over backwards not to deal with theater and drama. And that's understandable because, as Dominic and Avi were talking about, we only have so much time to learn languages and also disciplinary, sort of approaches and tools and all of that. So yes, none of us can sort of do all of that, and we do need to rely on each other. But one of the things I think has just been really generative from the conference is people coming to these different areas, sort of, coming from a lot of different angles. And also, I was thinking just about the ways in which so many of us have been talking about relationships among different fields, books as monuments, or the graphic design of books in conversation with the, with the texts in performance, text on the page, etc.
Thank you. Good. So I feel like we were leaning in there to question number 4 about the challenges of comparison. And I realized that this question also probably has a little bit of a different resonance for those of us who are more situated in Yiddish studies and those who are more situated in Holocaust studies. I mean, but I'm sure we're all aware that in Holocaust studies, Holocaust and genocide studies right now, the arguments are vicious. I mean, vicious. And I won't elaborate or even hint at examples because they're so vicious. And beyond Holocaust studies, I mean, just walk out the door and you know, you've got the Holocaust comparisons going on today. There was a really thoughtful piece in the New York Times by Jonathan Dechkel-Chen, whose son is held captive now in Gaza, about Holocaust comparisons. So that's all out there. And where does the research that we heard in this conference situate us, or how does it reflect on the question of comparison? I don't assume to have an answer. Just because we didn't actively invite comparisons into the conference doesn't mean we're against it, or, you know, but I wanna think about that with you. For me, it's an open question mark. If it's okay with our panelists, I see that Anya has raised her hand, so we'll start with her, if that's all right. Okay.
Oh my God, sorry, was I supposed to wait?
No, the rules are there are no rules. Okay.
Okay, so I want to make 2 points about that. One, I mean, it's a little bit bleeding from the other question, but one of the kind of areas that I think is still hard to get in is, you know, my people. Like Holocaust in the Soviet Union, when it comes to any aspect of Holocaust studies, even in Yiddish. I mean, Hashem Dank, Rebroskis, for bringing, you know, some of those poets into the mainstream discussion, but oh my God. And I'm wondering, you know, like, what's with that? Is it like still hard to believe all the Soviet-born people, because, you know, of all the things they say? Is it still hard to understand? Do we still have to put them in a separate section with no noon, you know what I mean? Like, to kind of give them voice. So to me, it's an interesting question. But for comparison, and I don't know, maybe I'm saying something wrong here, but, you know, ever since
just
October
so
7th
you
happened,
know, this is the one
yeah.
session that we're not recording, so you don't have to worry about saying something wrong. Okay, so please go
Oh God, I
ahead.
got into so much trouble. Yeah, the other one were recorded. No, but what I wanted to say is this. So ever since October 7th, you know, campuses here have been fun and all this. But for those of us who teach Holocaust and violence in context of other disciplines like myself, we had to, at least I had to ask myself every single day, what exactly am I studying? How does it resonate with people right now who are so not willing to hear about Jewish suffering and all that stuff that happens? And I started this project with my students, some of them of Palestinian descent and others just Arab speakers, on documenting, you know, Arab language poetry and memes and humor that comes out of Gaza right now. And I don't speak Arabic, so they started this project, so they collected these documents. And they presented it to class. And I have to say, some of the themes, some of the choices of metaphors, some of the ways that all this stuff was shaping up resonated so much with stuff I was seeing from, you know, Humor of Bershit Ghetto of 1942. You know, I mean, like, and also some of the themes that we've been discussing today, whereas the world doesn't care. You know, one piece a student recorded had words something like, I wish I was Ukrainian, then the doors of the world would be open for me, but I am here stuck and the world doesn't want me. Anyway, so I was thinking about maybe us studying how the language responds to catastrophe or to violence as it unfolds actually has a lot to offer in terms of understanding human experience. And, you know, I mean, I'm not prepared to write anything comparative or do anything comparative, but I've been thinking a lot about this. And I don't know if I'm alone, you know, like thinking about these themes and stuff, and it's super dangerous to even raise those issues in one sentence, you know what I mean? Like, but it's been on my mind, and I thought I would share that with you. So
thank you. And I'm glad to see hands raised. And I just point out that well, not surprisingly, we think alike often, I think, Anya, but that kind of a comparison is it's like the book covers that Roski's showed. I mean, it's a concrete, on the ground, etic comparison of small language to small language versus, you know, the big universalized icons and memes. So it's not just a question of comparison, yes or no, but different modalities of comparison and connection that maybe we could think about. So that's really, really very compelling what you've shared. Eric, please.
Yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts. One I don't have a resolution for, but I just want to acknowledge, I'm sure that the current situation, and we had the journalist session and it's been on people's minds, and just to be grappling with how Bernstein is dealing with famine in a time when there's so many people are starving in Gaza has just been profoundly, I don't know where to place it exactly, and I don't know if exactly, I wouldn't say exactly comparison, I don't know, but certainly context, and just extremely morally difficult, and just wanted to say that's obviously on my mind. In terms of comparison in the wider field, I think what's come out of the conference is my fear is that comparison. Every time you compare something, you I sort of intimated this in my opening remarks, but you kind of consolidate what you're comparing, right? You think you've got this, and then you're comparing it to that, and what this is, the representative of what the Holocaust is, leaves so much out, right? And I think that's the thing that I've come to appreciate, and even more after seeing all of your amazing presentations, that you have to think of what is being left out, and if that can be part of comparison, all the better, right? Because no matter what we compare, parts of both of the items or the phenomena being compared are being framed out of the discussion, and I think that can be the way that Yiddish voices have tended to be framed out of the discussion of the Holocaust in terms of bigger Holocaust, studies discourse, could be a really useful way to think about how have other people been framed out of the discussion. So that could be a point of comparison when we do these comparisons. What are the kind of even we're talking about catastrophe, even we're talking about crisis, there are still kind of silences within those crises, and how can we? That can be an aspect, kind of radical empathy that Hannah talked about towards the people, even when you're dealing with genocide. Like, what voices don't get talked about, even when you're talking about genocide. So I think that could be create a challenge, but I think that could be a way to do comparison that isn't quite so vicious, maybe, and more empathetic, and more understanding and open than is sometimes the case now.
Thank you. Yeah, and Eric has brought up several things, like comparison can lead to competition, as we've all seen. There's so many different ways that comparison leads, and that just in tracing the field and the way that things happened, historiographically, that there was this big humanizing moment of humanizing Holocaust survivors, let's say in the 90s, and Yiddish wasn't a high priority then. And then the field moved on to comparative genocide work, and then it's like, wait, you never got to humanize the other voice, the other languages. So I don't even know if that's actually an inherent intellectual flaw, or if that's just the way that things have gone. And there's kind of some catch-up work to do in terms of humanizing Western or Anglo-speaking survivor victim voices. Okay, I promised I wasn't going to talk. Whoop, this is Dominic.
Okay, I mean, maybe this is a simplistic way to think about it, but surely a lot of the kind of viciousness and the heat comes in comparison when you're thinking perpetrator to perpetrator, or perpetrator to alleged perpetrator comparisons. And when you're talking about victim survivor, I mean, as you say, that there are ways in which you can get into questions of competitive suffering. But I mean, there have been, right? And there has been for a long time a set of things that have come out of the discourse that you were talking about, Hannah, that are, I mean, I would say inherently comparative, right? Terms like trauma, testimony, memory are things that, have comfortably, and probably too comfortably, moved from one discourse to another. So, and from one frame to another. So surely one of the things that this conference has shown is, okay, we need other terms than trauma, testimony, and memory to be working with. And that then, again, exactly in the examples that Anna and Eric have given of ways that you might want to make comparisons. Yes, but I mean, I think it's Yeah, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Annika.
So my thoughts are not very well organized yet, but I thought I want to share some thoughts I had in terms of the kind of comparative dimension, but also touching upon one of the questions that you posed in terms of the multi-language dimension of multilinguistic dimension of the Holocaust. Because as somebody who studies the Holocaust in the German occupied Soviet territories, what I've been watching in recent years happening in the field is an increased attention to how the German occupation violence targeted kind of the whole population in the area to some extent, but also really struggling with highlighting the specificity of how some ethnic groups, including and primarily Jews, were targeted and violated and murdered. And so to me, what I've learned during this conference, and I'm really sad that I had to miss part of that because I was sick yesterday, is that looking to Yiddish sources allows us not only to get a fuller picture of the events of the Holocaust themselves, kind of the period during it and in the immediate aftermath, but also the legacies of that, and on the one hand to learn about the fact that there was Yiddish culture after the Holocaust, even in the Soviet Union, for instance, but that those Yiddish language sources also offer a perspective that we haven't really been able to appreciate so far, because we haven't accessed them, and because that precluded kind of a greater attention to Jewish life in the post-war Soviet Union. But alongside that, it also really allows us to identify the distinctions and both the connections and the disconnections within the shared suffering in these populations. And so to me, what this conference has really highlighted is on one hand, a greater attention to kind of the multinational experience really after genocide, and also how we can approach the very distinct and specific experiences within the field of the Holocaust, so to speak. So it's not only a comparison with other genocides, other kinds of wars, other instances of violence, but also within kind of the force field of the Holocaust, if you will. And so an increased attention to the diversity of the experience related to the Holocaust. And just one other dimension that I really noticed and just looking at the program and listening to some of the papers is that it also allows us to pay attention differently to gender again. Because I think what we've seen during this conference is that there's many, many more Jewish women who actually spoke and who left a record about their experiences, where for a long time, what people knew was Philip Friedman, and it was the Ringelblum archive. But there's actually much more to that. And I really appreciate that. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about these voices, because I think they've also been left out for a long time.
Great. So this is probably our last round. You know, we're gonna end the whole thing on time at 9:15. So if you remember anything about the conference at all, you'll remember that it was run on time. So I want to ask, what should we do next? If it's okay, I'd like to start with Daniel, and I'd really like to encourage, I mean, I know I'm really young and stuff, but maybe some of the younger, as David put it, scholars can pipe in here. It'd be really great to end the conference with a note looking towards the future, people who are just getting started or, you know, young at heart, young in their careers. So Daniel Stein, would you care to share anything about what you think we should do next?
Katanti, I'm actually quite happy to make space for other folks who haven't shared yet.
Well, you know, there's this thing that if you start talking, then they're going to raise their hands. So.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So I think in terms of what you all should, or this group should be doing next, I really do think that translation work seems to me to be quite critical, just because of the sheer volume of material that still isn't available outside of Yiddish. And I guess as somebody who is, again, like starting out, maybe an aspirational hope of, probably people say this all the time, but more credit given to the work and role of the translator, I think, is really also critical.
Cool. Other thoughts, please? Yes, Yaakov, please.
Hi, so I wanted to say, as many others said, thank you to all the organizers for a wonderful conference. And well, it just happened, but Lewolski's lecture left me with the image by Sheik, and with kind of the very, talking about representation, the very realistic representation of the people, and the very kitschy or hyperbolic representation of the knife in the ship. And I think something about what comes next is kind of this confluence of two forms of narratology in that one picture, or two modes of kind of thinking and talking about tragedy in that one tablet. And I disliked the image at first, but it stayed with me from the lecture, and thinking about how kind of these dissonances come into play in the way we talk about or represent the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any other closing thoughts? Yes, Miriam. You're on mute, my dear.
Sorry. Women and children, in the same way that the humanities at large have kind of been undergoing this shift, this, kind of large-scale shift from attention to the best that has been thought and said by elite men, and bringing in attention to all of these other kinds of experience. So too, in this domain, whether we conceptualize it as Holocaust studies or a branch of Yiddish studies or other configurations, but that seems like a really important direction. More sophistication with how we conceptualize time at different scales, and temporality, including developmental time of the individual and how that is in tension or in sync with other kinds of time scales. And then just a really wonderful slogan that comes out of the disability studies world and disability activism, nothing about us without us. And I feel like this conference really kind of marks a landmark for Yiddish in relation to the Holocaust, in saying, nothing about these Yiddish speaking populations without coming from within Yiddish.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we have 3 minutes. If there's anybody who's burning to say something, now's your chance. I'll start my wrap-up words that I wanted to say, is that we couldn't meet in person. We did something good for the environment in doing this on Zoom. I know that was hard. I had Twix for dinner yesterday. But one of the things is that one purpose of a conference is for networking and for sharing what you're about to publish and for getting new opportunities, especially for scholars who are up and coming, but for all of us. We want people to know what we're working on. We want to share. And so please, use this conference as an opportunity to network. Please reach out to each other. Use the yearbook that we set up. Anybody who forgot to send in their things for the yearbook, we'll add you in and we'll update it. Please, be in touch with each other. That was what we wanted to do here. We wanted to create a we to emphasize that we could have a we, that we've had a we in the making. So on that note, I'm really, really grateful that this happened, and maybe somebody else from the conference can say goodbye before I embarrass myself.
I can say something. Yeah, so I mean, what I would say is thank you everybody for taking part in this. I think it's been an extraordinary experience. Obviously doing it on Zoom and not face to face has all sorts of losses, but I think there's been such huge gains, and I think it will be you know, something that I will be thinking about, and certainly something that I've learned from and will be thinking about for a very long time. And I really hope that we can continue a lot of these dialogues that are going here. And of course, thank you. Well, no, okay. Thank you to the technical team. I think it came good eventually. And thank you to the support staff. Thank you very much to Yavita. That was an extraordinary job that you've done there. Thank you, Mika. That was also brilliant. Thanks for coming in. Thanks to Vered, who I don't think is here now, but was doing a lot of work behind the scenes earlier on. And of course, thanks to Eric, and thanks to Hannah. The energy, the enthusiasm, what you put into there clearly says to me, I need to be eating more Twix bars, because they're obviously doing something pretty extraordinary. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. So it's exactly 9:15. We'll end on that. Let this be the beginning. Take care of yourselves. Be safe. Thank you, everyone. It's been an honor and a pleasure. And a gute Nacht.